Greetings and welcome, everyone. I'm Nichola Dyer, Senior Advisor and Manager of the Global Seaweed Coalition's Secretariat. It's my great pleasure to guide this conversation today. On behalf of the Coalition, I'm truly delighted to welcome you all to our first scientific webinar of 2023 on seaweed and carbon dioxide removal. First, a couple of words about the Global Seaweed Coalition. We're a global partnership established to support the safety and sustainability of the seaweed industry as it scales up and to unite a fragmented market through a unified vision and goals grounded in science. And we do that through our 4 action pillars: funding, advocacy, science and technology, and policy. We provide seed funding for local forums, for projects. We spread the seaweed narrative in global, national, and local forums. We share knowledge about scientific and technological developments and good practices in the industry. And we drive and influence policy change from local to global levels. The coalition was launched in March of 2021 as the Safe Seaweed Coalition, with funding of £3 million from our initial founding funder for an initial 3 years from Lloyd's Register Foundation, as well as support from the French National Research Center, CNRS, and United Nations Global Compact, which now houses the coalition. And so far, we've delivered over €1 million in financing, 1.1 million euros in financing through 2 competitive calls for proposals, and we expect to run a 3rd call later this year. Coalition members represent the entire seaweed value chain, from smallholder farmers all the way through to multinational businesses, specialized research institutes to intergovernmental organizations. We're all working together to realize the full potential of the seaweed sector and to ensure its safety for consumers, workers, and the environment. So let's have a couple of housekeeping details before we get into the substance of the event. First of all, please feel free to let us know who you are, to say hi and share your institution through the chat. And of course, please feel free throughout to post questions or comments in the chat. Azadine, our communications manager, and Andrea, our communications intern, are going to be monitoring the chat, and they'll either respond directly there if you've got questions, or they'll flag them to me so I can collect them and we can put them to Catriona after her presentation. And by the way, even though we're all so familiar with Zoom calls at this point, please remember to mute unless you're called upon. And now, turning to our event. The objective is to provide scientific information about seaweed and its role in atmospheric carbon dioxide removal, and to facilitate a dialogue about that. Our keynote speaker, Dr. Catriona Hurd, will share the results of her deep dive into this complex and often misunderstood topic. So let me take you through the very simple agenda for this event. First, our scientific director, Philippe Potin, will give a brief introduction to the scientific work of the coalition and our advisory scientific council, which Catriona is a member of, before introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Catriona Hurd. Catriona will then speak for about 25 minutes. She's got a great presentation planned for you, and then we'll open the floor for about 15 minutes of questions and answers and chat from the floor. And we'll close at about 5 minutes to the hour. Now, before I turn over to Philippe, we have a little tradition where we do group photos in this coalition. So at this point, could I ask you all to please turn on your cameras, and we're going to do a group photo. Azadine, our communications manager, is our master of ceremonies for these things. So he's going to let us know when to smile, when to stop smiling. Azadine, it is over to you. Thanks. And no need to spotlight me anymore. Thanks.
Yeah, so let me unspotlight you. Okay, so I'm seeing you all on a very nice grid. So can you all smile, please?
Seaweed.
Here we go. We are good.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So time for the main event. Philippe, over to you for the introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola, and hello to all of you. It's really a pleasure to introduce you this session with Catriona Hurd and to talk a bit about the scientific work of the Global Seaweed Coalition. Of course, the coalition is relying on the collective scientific expertise to guide our action, especially to guide the content of our funding and policy recommendations. We support all levels of scientific endeavor on seaweeds, from basic science to innovative technologies. And we have a multi-dimensional focus on safety, thanks to our initial funder, the Lloyd Racer Foundation. We are focusing on food and consumer safety, but also we have a strong emphasis on environmental safety, on occupational health, and on workers' safety in the sector. So the topic we have supported in the 25 projects which were already supported by the funding of the coalition were in different sectors, including the packaging, bio-based packaging sectors, biosecurity, especially for seedlings and cultivation methods for seaweeds, but also on certification and traceability, a very important point for the commercialization of seaweeds. We have supported different type of activity, from workshops to organization of task forces, staff exchanges, and technology platform. And in the future, we are willing to really increase our impact to develop this type of tools for the seaweed industry. But we will continue to support as much as possible capacity building, training in the sectors, educational programs in all continents. So with the new organization of the coalition under the supervision of Global Compact, we have established a new scientific council, and Catriona Hurd will be one of the members of this council. And this council will have a very important responsibility to keep the work of the coalition science-based. In fact, we are ready to provide with the scientific committee scientific guidelines to support funding advocacy of the coalition. We will, of course, continue to evaluate proposals and organize the call for proposals for the coalitions, for providing all scientific advices for that. But of course, we are also willing to have a stronger impact and, in fact, contribute to provide some ethical guidance for the sectors. And within that, we will try to discuss within the scientific committee for the writing of important position papers, or having the possibility to really provide a vision for the coalition in a very important journal for scientific journals. But now it's time for me to open the floor to my great colleague, Catriona Hurd. Catriona is professor at the University of Hobart, and she has developed more than 30 years of research on environmental regulation of seaweed growth and primary pollutions, including by carbon and nitrogen supply, light, water motions, and temperatures. And she is currently focusing on climate change impact on seaweeds, and especially ocean acidification, warming, and marine heat waves, and how it may influence also the seaweed aquaculture, especially for in sector of Tasmania. And she is presently also providing scientific advices on the assessments of seaweeds for use in carbon trading scheme. So she has a very bright career, and she wrote also very important books for textbooks like Seaweed Ecology and Physiology, and she received in 2015 a prize for that from the Phycological Society of America. I'm delighted, and we are delighted to welcome her to present her important research on seaweeds and atmospheric carbon dioxide removal. So, Catriona, the floor is yours. So we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Philippe. I'm just going to share my screen. Thanks for that introduction. I think I've been doing this for about 30 years now, so I'm getting on a bit. So the list of what I do just keeps going up. Anyway, so I'm going to talk about, I'm just starting my stopwatch here, forensic carbon accounting, assessing the roles of seaweeds and carbon dioxide removal. And this is me, and then these are the collaborators that I've been working with, which I'm not going to talk about. So the talk outline, I'm going to talk to you about the seaweeds of cold temperate systems. So this you should most of you all know about. And then the need for carbon dioxide removal and sequestration. So why are seaweeds or kelps in particular being considered for carbon dioxide removal and sequestration? And I start this talk with the contrast with terrestrial forests. So I often find that we know what terrestrial forests do and how they take up carbon dioxide and sequester it. And it's a good starting point for the conversation. So then I'll talk to you about forensic carbon accounting, what it is. It's a framework for assessing for any seaweed-based system, actually any marine-based system really, the role in taking up atmospheric carbon dioxide. And then I'm going to focus on this last point, which is why measuring air-sea interactions is critical for financial carbon, for forensic carbon accounting. So briefly, seaweeds of cold temperate systems, we all know, well, most of you all know, apart from those who work in the tropics, that the seaweeds are major primary producers, all coastal systems, in fact. And there's red, green, and brown. Those are three evolutionary distinct phyla, so they're not closely related to each other at all, apart from about 1.2 billion years ago when they were closely related. And really, this talk, we're going to talk about kelps, the brown seaweeds of the order Laminariae. So seaweeds are important primary producers. They take up carbon dioxide, they recycle carbon dioxide, they take up nitrogen, they cycle nitrogen. They provide food and habitat for a multitude of marine life. So they're super important in coastal systems. So the kelps, these are the large brown seaweeds in the order Laminariales, and these do grow to be the biggest of all seaweeds. And the kelp forests are they're vitally important, but they're in a global decline. And in Tasmania, for example, here in Australia, we've lost 95% of our macrocystis canopy already due to ocean warming, and that's a canopy there, but there's not many patches of that left anymore. So they're important, and there's a lot of ongoing work to restore them. And we also know, thanks to this paper that was published this morning, as far as I can tell, that a very small amount of seaweed carbon, it is less than 1% of the global amount of carbon in sediments, does come from seaweed. So they do have a role in blue carbon, albeit small, but it's important. And certainly but for coastal systems, their productivity is super important. All right, so the need for carbon dioxide removal. We are in the midst of a climate crisis, as I'm sure you're all aware. And if we want to keep warming less than 2 degrees, and this is getting less likely by the day, we've got to drastically reduce emissions. So we have to stop emitting carbon dioxide. That's the number one thing that we know we can probably do if we wanted. But we also have to take carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere. So we've got too much in there now, so we've got to take it back out. So that's called carbon dioxide removal, and it used to be called negative emissions. And we've got to remove about 100 to 900 gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by 2100, and remembering that 1 gigaton is 1 billion tons of carbon, so it's a huge amount of carbon we have to take out. And seaweeds have been proposed as a biological method of carbon dioxide removal, so I think we're probably all aware of that. And there's lots of media hype around this, and it's still going on. Kelp is coming, how seaweed could prevent catastrophic climate change. Here, they're sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, apparently, and their seaweed farms are like planting forests in the ocean. So there's an analogy to terrestrial trees, like seaweeds are like that. And it's really being promoted as this simple, safe solution to climate change. It's a natural solution, right? So if you grow seaweeds, for example, in this case, in the open ocean, then it's kind of a natural, nice thing to do. So when seaweeds absorb lots of CO2, it can be cut off, allowed to sink to the bottom of the deep ocean, taking carbon dioxide with it. This is a book for primary school children. Our oceans are so vast, we can have thousands of underwater forests helping to restore the health of our planet. It's great. I almost believe it myself. And you can already buy seaweed carbon credits on the market, should you wish. Green ocean carbon bonds, serious deal this. If you spend £300 sterling, that's 600 Australian dollars, you can offset your entire family's emissions for a whole year. That's got to be worth doing. Now, this, of course, is not based on fact at all, but they are being sold. And we know that there's a lot of interest globally in using seaweeds for carbon dioxide removal in both the coastal and the open oceans. And I'm not really going into this in much detail, just to say that, you know, there's a lot of interest in it. These are three of the bigger, better funded projects. We've got Running Tide, who are operating out of Iceland at the moment. They want to grow seaweeds on buoys, float them in the ocean, and then sink them to the deep ocean to sequester carbon. Then we have Kelp Blue, mostly operating out in Namibia at the moment. And they, I think, are more interested in growing seaweeds for biostimulants or bioplastics, which would then be used as sort of alternatives to oil-based products. And then we have Climate Foundation, which is more in my part of the world, who are looking at doing artificial upwelling to fertilize open ocean kelp forests for carbon dioxide removal, but also for potentially for other products. And, you know, this is the Ross et al. Paper, which just shows you a whole bunch of different ways that people are thinking about growing seaweeds in the coastal and open oceans. So there's a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of funding for it. So that's the background. And now I'm just going to run by some definitions for you. So, and this is super important. You have to define what you're talking about with carbon dioxide removal and carbon sequestration. So carbon dioxide removal is a process that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and results in sequestration. Sequestration is the secure storage of carbon-containing molecules for 100 years outside the atmosphere. Now, you can use any number. You can use 10 years if you want, but really that's no use, because we need to lock the atmospheric carbon dioxide away in a way that's safe, reliable, and verifiable for at least 100 years. We don't want it coming back out again in 20 years' time. It's super important that it's locked away permanently. And so the other definition, carbon credits or carbon removal offsets, those are things that can be used in carbon trading schemes, which is kind of the focus of this talk. Now, here's a problem we have in the seaweed literature, is that carbon sequestration has been incredibly loosely defined, and it means different things to different people. It means net primary production, i.e. photosynthesis, carbon fixation, which is actually the fixation of inorganic carbon by the enzyme rubisco. It can mean carbon standing stock or biomass, so that's literally the amount of, you know, seaweed per unit area. It can mean carbon sink, which is seriously loosely defined, and it could also be breakdown products of seaweed carbon that are buried in the sediment. Now, none of these alone are carbon sequestration. They are not carbon sequestration, but the very last one is super important in working out carbon sequestration. It's part of the puzzle that we need to know, which I'll come back to that in a minute. So I keep having to move this thing around my screen. So our goals, so this is an educational talk, you know, I've not got any bias in any direction, but what we're trying to do, me and the colleagues who are mostly biogeochemists, global carbon cycle people, are to educate non-experts on the fundamental principles that regulate carbon dioxide removal and sequestration by seaweeds, explain the complexities of monitoring, reporting, and verifying seaweed carbon, and provide a framework that researchers, governments, and NGOs can use as a starting point to assess seaweed carbon in different systems. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to start by talking about terrestrial forests. So terrestrial forests, we know, are used for carbon credits and offsets. And trees store carbon as living biomass on relevant timescales. So, you know, if a tree is more than 100 years old, then you could count that as sequestered carbon. Certainly if it's 3,000 years old, it is. Of course, if there's a forest fire, that will go straight back into the atmosphere, which is problematic, but at least it is actually a store. Now, more importantly for trees is that they make soil. And there's 3 times as much carbon stored in the top meter of soil globally than there is in the entire Earth's atmosphere. So soil carbon is a tremendously important carbon storage on our planet. And it's quite easy to assess carbon storage by trees, like carbon sequestration, because I'll tell you why in a minute. You just measure CO2 going in, and then the CO2 going out through respiration. And then you can measure how much wood's there and how much soil's been made. So it's fairly straightforward, hard, but relatively easy. Seaweed systems are just not like trees. So they've got short time spans. So they don't store carbon as living biomass on timescales relevant to sequestration. Most seaweeds only live to be about maximum 10 years. Most of them are a lot smaller. I appreciate some maybe live 20 years, but it's still not relevant for sequestration. So they're not living biomass. So what happens to seaweed carbon? Well, they don't make soil as such, not like trees, but this you get particulate organic carbon. So that's big chunks of seaweed or small particles of seaweed. And some of that does end up in the sediments. You've got POC, most of it is consumed by invertebrates. So it's eaten by things living in the system. You've got dissolved organic carbon. This is tiny, tiny stuff. And you know, the seaweed release a lot of this naturally, and there's some evidence. We know that there's long-term deposits of dissolved organic carbon in the deep ocean, but we have no idea if seaweeds contribute to this. And it's probably very minimal, I would suggest, but who knows? And then we've also got respiration. So seaweeds don't live by themselves. They're covered in all sorts of animals. They're all busily respiring. The seaweeds also respire and only photosynthesize in the day. So actually carbon dioxide is a lost term. And in some situations, a seaweed system can be heterotrophic, so it can actually be releasing carbon dioxide. But this is the one thing that's really important that's not been studied. And this is the air-sea interactions. And this is critical. And I'm going to go into details in this in a minute. So forensic carbon counting. This is used, if you're a forensic accountant, you look at people's businesses and you audit them. So you make sure the business's finances are legitimate. And no fraud. They're checking for fraud. Forensic carbon accounting is the same idea, to check that carbon fixation by seaweeds results in carbon dioxide removal. So it combines seaweed budgets, uptake and release, with a carbon life cycle analysis. And it's designed to ensure that carbon credits and offsets allocated to seaweed systems are legitimate, that they can be verified. And we need a framework like this because we've got to have verification and integrity. And to be able to allocate carbon credits to seaweeds or anything, you've got to be able to monitor, report and verify. And around the world, there's a lot of questions being asked now about these carbon offsets and which of them are real and which of them are not. So we have to make sure as scientists that our carbon offsets are verifiable. So here's the framework, which is, I know, appreciate it's kind of boring table, but anyway, this is the framework. You have to measure a whole bunch of stuff to work out if seaweeds are sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, removing atmospheric carbon dioxide. Some stuff's easy to do. So we can measure photosynthesis, we can measure the standing stocks of seaweeds, we can measure how much carbon's in those seaweed beds, we can measure respiration by invertebrates and seaweeds, and we can work out turnover times in seaweed beds. So that stuff's relatively straightforward. We've been doing it for years. This stuff's not so easy. It's much more difficult to work out where the carbon is going. So where is the dissolved organic carbon, the particular organic carbon, and the dissolved carbon dioxide going? So it's being exported to other systems. And particularly important for this is to work out how the detection and quantification of seaweed in the sediments. That's a key step. But this is the other key step. And I would argue that at the moment, it's by far the most difficult step. And this is the air-sea carbon dioxide re-equilibration or equilibration. And this is the critical step if you actually want to work out if you've got carbon dioxide removal by your system. So here's some, this is nighttime for me. And I admit that carbonate chemistry is tricky in the daytime, but anyway, in the nighttime for me, It's really important to know this re-equilibration between the atmosphere and air. So carbon dioxide enters seawater as a gas, and then it becomes its aqueous phase. And it doesn't just react, it doesn't do what other gases do. It actually reacts with the water molecule, and it sets up the seawater carbonate system. So this is what acts to buffer seawater pH, and this is what ocean acidification is perturbing. Now, to get in and out of seawater, and it is an equilibrium, you see the arrows are going both ways. It moves by diffusion. Diffusion is a very slow process. But the fact that it then reacts with seawater and forms a carbonate system is another step that makes it very slow process, the equilibration of atmosphere and CO2 in the water. And in fact, no one ever believes me, but I can tell you that biogeochemists think this is the simplest thing on the planet. The timescales of equilibration for carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the ocean are in the coastal ocean, weeks to months, so let's say minimum 3 weeks. In the open ocean, months to years, and the Arctic, it can be more than years. And if you don't believe me, you have to go to the NOAA website, and it will tell you straight there, it takes about 1 year to equilibrate carbon dioxide in the surface ocean with the atmosphere. All right, so it's very slow, and it's much slower than other gases. It's 20 times slower than oxygen, for example, to equilibrate between the air and the ocean. Why is this important? This is why it's important. So terrestrial plants, as I just showed you, take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in a one-step process. They literally take it out of the air, and then they fix it, and half of it goes back out in respiration. Seaweeds, it's a two-step process. So step one, seaweeds take up photosynthesis, just like terrestrial plants, take it up from seawater. So it's been come out of the seawater. This happens on a timescale of seconds, same for plants. But what happens now is you've got a parcel of seawater sitting here. It could be a really big parcel of seawater, and that has got a deficit of carbon dioxide in it. But where's the carbon dioxide? It's still in the atmosphere. There has been no carbon dioxide drawdown or carbon dioxide removal. So the CO2 is in the atmosphere, and it's going to take at least 3 weeks for the CO2 from the atmosphere to equilibrate with this water that the seaweed's just taken the carbon dioxide out of. So you've got two processes that are on completely different timescales. And this makes things really tricky. So I'll just talk, this is my new figure. I thought I'd share this with you. So if you've got a seaweed bed or a seaweed farm, so it could be a coastal seaweed bed, it could be seaweeds growing on lines on a farm, inshore, offshore, wherever. You've got to work, here's your seaweed bed. The seaweed's going to, number B, letter B, are going to take up your carbon dioxide and bicarbonate. C, you've got a parcel of water around your seaweed bed or farm, and it could be very big, and that has got a deficit of carbon dioxide in it. But the carbon dioxide is still in the atmosphere. And this water is most likely going to move away. Unless you've got absolutely no mixing, the water is going to move somewhere else. And here it is exiting stage right. And some more water is going to come in. And that will then have a deficit around it. So off it and on it goes. So where does that water go to? Because that water has got to equilibrate with the atmosphere if you want to get carbon dioxide removal. And it takes up to a minimum of 3 weeks for that to happen. So let's say your water ends up in another seaweed bed or continues in a seaweed bed or in a seaweed farm. It's massive. And it's been there for 3 weeks. And then it could be long enough to get equilibration, full CO2 equilibration. And that is then drawdown of atmospheric CO2. And then you have to prove that the seaweed is that seaweed biomass is stored securely. But, you know, seaweed, it might not move over another seaweed bed. It might move over like an oyster bed or a mussel bed or a barnacle bed that's heterotrophic. So the animals are releasing CO2. So then our seaweed water is mixing with water that's actually got loads of CO2 in it. And you can end up with CO2 going back in the atmosphere. And irrespective, it just makes it really hard to know how much drawdown you got. And in the open ocean, this is common in the open ocean, less so in the coastal ocean. Your patch of seawater actually goes under another patch of seawater that's less dense, and it never re-equilibrates. So you never got equilibration, or you've only got partial equilibration. So it's tricky. And I took this out, but I put it back in again, Nichola, as you can see. Why is this so important? And here's an example from the Sargasso Sea. So I'm sure you're all aware, we've got the Sargasso Sea here, which is the only natural floating seaweeds in the world. There's only 2 species that grow in the Sargasso Sea. But more recently, there's this Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt formed here, which is thought to have formed due to anthropogenic inputs, like way too many nutrients going into the system. So it's bloomed like a harmful algal bloom. So we've got this new Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt sitting here, which is causing all sorts of issues on beaches in Florida and other places. So Leonard Bach did this really nice work, and what he's doing is using the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt as an analog for what open ocean afforestation might look like, what growing seaweeds in the open ocean might look like in terms of carbon dioxide removal. So here on the top panel, you've got this red patch. That's your Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt. There's your sargassum. And the colours underneath tell you how long the water is resident for. No, sorry, it doesn't. That's completely wrong. It tells you how long the annual timescale of equilibration between the ocean and atmosphere. So, for example, this dark blue patch here, it's taking 4 months in this dark blue bit to get full equilibration between the ocean and the atmosphere. And these other lighter blue patches, it's taking longer, up to 12 months to get full re-equilibration. And then the next bit, this is modelled, by the way, is the residence time of water in the surface mixed layer. So this is how long the water in the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt is actually in contact with the air. So that's how long it gets, that's how long it's got to re-equilibrate between, so the drawdown of atmospheric CO2. And then you can plot the ratio of these two. And what that tells you in this case is that the atmospheric CO2 influx to the surface water after photosynthesis, photosynthetic fixation, takes 2.5 to 18 times longer than the seawater is in contact with the atmosphere. So what that means is, in a large proportion, a lot of the time, that seawater is actually gone somewhere else or subducted, actually subducted in this case, before it's had a chance to re-equilibrate. So there's the net drawdown is substantially lower than you might imagine from photosynthesis. All right, almost done. So to verify that seaweed beds or farms are removing atmospheric carbon dioxide, you've got to do 2 things, and they're both really difficult to measure. You've got to look at the extent of air-sea carbon dioxide re-equilibration. So you've got to do that in a moving body of water, and you've actually got to monitor that water for weeks to over a year. Obviously, modelling could help in this situation. And that will let you quantify how much carbon dioxide was actually removed from the atmosphere. But then in the second step, you've got to verify that the seaweed biomass that actually fixed the CO2, and it might have fixed it like 100 kilometers away from where that water mass ended up, has actually been securely stored for 100 years. And those 2 processes you've got to link if you want to measure CDR by seaweeds. So this is what it looks like in a figure. You've got all these processes in white, which are the sinking, the sinking biomass maybe, or dissolved organic carbon, particularly organic carbon sediments and so forth. But then you've got this water body that is moving, most likely moving away from where the CO2 is actually fixed. And you've somehow got to link both these processes. So to summarize, the ultimate control of carbon dioxide removal is air-sea equilibration. And if you want to legitimately claim carbon credits and offsets, you've got to verify how much CO2 is removed, that's tracking the parcel of water, and how much of that removed CO2 is then securely stored for more than 100 years. So that's following the fate of the seaweed from the seaweed bed or farm. And, we've focused a lot on using seaweeds for atmospheric, for CO2 removal. And I think my question to you, which you don't have to answer, I'm just throwing it out there, is this actually going to work? Not clear to me. And are there other things that might be better? And I think some people are moving on to this now. Emissions reduction, the methane reduction for cows and sheep, Asparagopsis, there's promise with that. Although, again, the science isn't fully rigorous yet, but there's certainly promise. And maybe we need to do it, you see, we biomass differently. So biostimulants, for example, to enhance soil carbon or plant growth on land. So there's other, using them for offsets in different ways, like bioplastics and so on. So anyway, irrespective of whatever way you want to use seaweeds for carbon, you actually have to do a full forensic carbon accounting type thing to work out how much carbon dioxide they're actually removing and how much they're offsetting, to do it rigorously. And that's the lot. Thank you. Done.
Thank you very much, Catriona. That was really
That's kind
terrific.
of a romp. There's a bit of a romp through a whole load of things. Right? It's very complex.
Yeah, it is, and that's why it's so important, and that's why we're so grateful to you for doing this, because
you're very welcome.
You helped to explain it with your diagrams and a very clear, simple explanation, helping to render a very complex and important topic understandable for those of us who, some of us might have taken some basic chemistry, some of us might not, but I think that I'm sure that everybody here feels like they understand this better now. Now, there have been some questions in the chat. Anushka asked a question, and I was trying to find it back in the chat, but there's so much going on. Oh, here. So Anushka, why don't we just ask you to ask your question directly, if you don't mind.
Hi, yes, good morning, early morning here. For me, I know it's late for you, Catriona. Yeah. But a quick question. I think one thing that we struggle with here in the US is trying to determine how to financially or fiscally support something like carbon offsets. And that's really across the board for any type of, not just seaweed, but any type of carbon offset process. And so that one slide that you showed for 300 sterling, I believe it was, for the carbon offsets, I believe it has to do with car emissions. How is that? Where does the funding come from? So, who supports it?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Seriously, I found that I did a Google search. It literally took me 10 minutes and I found 3 companies, and these are, I think they're all small, they're pretty small companies. It wasn't clear to me that they had any background in seaweed stuff, and I think they're making the numbers up because that is just not a real.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
But I don't know where the money comes from, and yeah, you could, if you just Google it. I know it's so lazy, but just Google seaweeds for carbon credits and it will throw up a bunch of things.
Which highlights the importance of getting the science right.
We have to be I think as scientists, we have to be super careful at the moment with this stuff, because, if we've misled the public, because that is actually misleading the public. And we can't do that. We have to be absolutely rigorous and squeaky clean, or we'll lose public trust.
Yes, indeed. So, Catriona, we do have some more questions coming in the chat, and there was one before we started. So I'm going to collect some questions from those who are in the room right now. But we did have Suben Zhang. I may be mispronouncing your name. If so, apologies. You were making a point, and perhaps you'd like to just speak to that. About kelp blue.
It looks like he left the meeting.
Okay. So the point was, if everybody has seen this in the chat, just that kelp blue is growing kelp forests and only harvesting the canopy to turn into products such as biostimulants, which was what Catriona was saying. And the rest of the biomass remains in the water to form an ecosystem. So there's a combination now of comments coming in the chat. And right now I'm just going to encourage people to raise your hands using the Zoom hand raise function so that I actually see you. Alejandro, I see your question. Catriona, Alejandro's question is, do you agree also that not all seaweeds are showing equally showing different patterns? Sorry, Alejandro. For example, kelp with floating canopy versus subtotal kelp. And Alan, I saw that you had raised your hand. So let's see, Alan, what is your question? And that way, Catriona, you can take Alan's and Alejandro's together.
Oh, thank you very much, Catriona. The question that I had in terms of growing, if there is possible to do so, too much seaweed, do you also think that we could be creating oceanic deserts by stealing the nutrients from other trophic levels, such as plankton, and then so on, so on, so on?
Yeah, well, yes. I didn't talk about that.
No, well,
but
it's mixed.
You'll be pleased to hear we're just about to publish something on that. But
great.
But that's exactly what happens. So that well, there's two things here in the open ocean. Number one, seaweeds have an incredibly high requirement for iron.
Yes.
And we just published a paper showing that the iron requirements of, for example, the kelp macrocystis are 1,000 times higher than those available in the open ocean. So it's probably not going to do very well. And the thing is that the phytoplankton that live in these regions, the high nitrogen, low chlorophyll regions, are actually incredibly well adapted to that. They've got all sorts of really amazing physiological mechanisms that allows them to do really quite well with very low iron. Our seaweeds would be competing with them. They probably won't grow. A lot of them won't grow in the open ocean. I appreciate that sargassums are different, but it's not a kelp either, and it is very different. And Alejandro's point, surface versus deep. Yes, well, if they're underwater, then you've actually got a much greater gradient to get that carbon dioxide down across. So if they're growing on the surface, so phytoplankton, for example, grow on the ocean surface, right? And they float with the water. And so they are always in contact with atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that is why we know that they sequester carbon. Seaweeds do not float on the surface, apart from the Sargasso Sea. They grow in the water column. If they're on the surface, then you're more likely to get some drawdown. If they're at 15 meters, then that's a huge way to get that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You know, it's a big diffusion problem with a bit of mixing. Anyway, it's complex.
And Thierry, you have a question.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. First, Catriona, thank you so much for your presentation. It's a great presentation. I really enjoy it, even early in the morning. So,
thanks for getting up.
One thing we should be clear is that most seaweeds are grown for a purpose. We just not grow them like that. We have a purpose. We want to do something with them. So most of the time we grow them, we harvest them, we process them. So for me, it's carbon transformation, but it's not carbon sequestration. And I think it's a key point. And I would like to know if you know how to explain what can be double accounting for the general public, but also for financial institutions and people that want to develop a carbon credit and everything. How can we put that in the mind of people that a lot of it is carbon transformation, not sequestration?
And Catriona, before you answer that, let me also take the question from Arnie, and then please answer both of them together. So Arnie, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Nichola and Catriona. Thanks very much for a very interesting presentation. It may be a stupid question, but it's fundamental.
No such thing, right?
No such thing.
This would apply to any other sort of vegetative organism that is growing in the water column. The balancing of the CO2 between the air and the ocean would
it
cause
applies,
the same problem. For seagrass, for instance.
Yeah, it's the same. And actually,
It's the same. Yeah.
that equilibration problem, there's a nice paper, a seagrass paper on that, and it shows that if you start, when you start to do the air-sea interactions, when you take that into account, some systems will actually, they're releasing CO2, they're not sequestering it at all. So it's really important even for seagrass systems. I think mangroves are different because they're actually, I mean, in my view, being a completely non-expert on mangroves, they're actually taking it out of the atmosphere again, but seagrass has taken it out of the water, CO2 out of the water. So you have the same problem as you do with seaweeds. But they also make soil, which seaweeds don't. So, you know, you've got a balance. I think mangroves are most likely to be, you know, taking it out of the atmosphere and storing it in soil, as if we're talking about blue carbon. And Thierry, I've actually forgotten your question already because I have
transformation.
Oh, well, I totally agree. I mean, it's like growing seaweed for food, right? You eat it and it's just going to come back out as methane and carbon dioxide.
And
Sad
we
but
have
true.
a question. Sorry, go, please finish on that because we've got a question in the chat. Anything more that you wanted to say to Thierry? We're good?
You know, it's a question when you say forensic accounting or anything. I think part of the forensic accounting will have to be make sure that we are not doing double accounting.
I think that's a good point. And that framework, it has got full life cycle analyses in there. You know, it's actually got a lot more in there than I talked about. And it has got all the loss terms, you know, processing and so forth. It actually goes through the whole, I mean, to do it properly, you have to go through the whole thing. I was only talking about a small part of that framework.
Yeah. And Catriona Harrison is asking about efforts to use seaweed biomass for the construction industry. And is this a way to sequester carbon in the long run, he asks?
I think, well, it's, again, you'd have to do a full forensic accounting to work out that you haven't got more loss terms in the processing than you have got in the storing. But, you know, if you store it, there are various things. If you can store it in bricks, for example, for 100 years, then it's the same as using timber from wood. You just got to make sure it's there. You know, it's got to be stored long term. It's got to be verifiable. It can't be something that you kind of put up and then it all falls down in 30 years. Like we make houses in Australia.
So I'm not seeing any questions coming up, but that surprises me because that suggests that everybody has understood everything and has no more questions for Catriona. And
well, that's good.
I mean, it was a very clear presentation, but there we go. I knew if I challenged, then somebody would ask something. Alan, go ahead.
A question for Catriona. Do you think that the doo-doo will hit the fan soon and that we will lose public trust because some of these, some of the families investing their £300 a year are going to feel ripped off?
It's a risk. And, you know, we had a situation down here a few years ago where people were raising money. I'm not going to talk about who or what, but literally they got about $30,000 from, you know, the local public to use seaweeds to sequester carbon, right? And this is kind of what triggered me to start on this, like, exploration of what is and isn't sequestration.
Yeah.
Because you cannot mislead the public. We cannot. And if we lose public trust, you know, and confidence, then you can grow as many seaweeds as you know. You just got to be super careful. And I think that, you know, with the big companies and stuff too, they're, you know, and NGOs and so forth, that they're just that, you know, that messaging has to be very careful. So it's not misleading. And a lot of, you know, if you look on some of the websites, you would honestly think that we are going to save the world like this, and it's just not that simple. And I wish it was. And I feel really sad every time someone says to me, but I thought, the number of students say to me, but I thought seaweeds were going to save the world because they take up all this carbon. We're going to grow them. And I say, no, it's probably not really like that. And they get really sad because people are looking for hope at the moment.
Yeah.
But it's our job to be realistic, right? We can't just give them false hope.
So we have time we've got 2 more questions lined up with live speakers, and we have a question in the chat, which is essentially about the interactions between seagrass and seaweed in carbon sequestration. And then doing a cut. So each of you, Philippe, Thierry, and Arnie, I challenge you to ask your question really pithy, because we've got 4 more minutes before we start wrapping up. So Philippe, over to you.
Yeah, Catriona, you were mentioning that at the moment in Tasmania there is a lot of effort to restore the white forest of giant kelps, and in fact, when we were telling that seaweed cultivation is not contributing so much to capturing carbon in comparison with the wild seaweeds, there is a big challenge to keep the wild stock of seaweeds alive for the future, and especially to really be able to keep the potential of all the services which are provided, because you of course you were focusing your talk on carbon sequestration, but you also work on ocean acidification, and we know that locally seaweeds are contributing to control ocean acidification, and that will also provide additional services which will help to mitigate climate change in the oceans. So,
yes, from an ocean acidification perspective, yes.
Yeah.
And there's evidence for that. There's still a bunch of caveats on that too, but yes, it's more likely. And the thing is with restoration is that, these are really important ecosystems, and it doesn't matter whether they sequester carbon or not. I mean, they do a little bit, there's no doubt in that. But that doesn't matter. The fact is they're incredibly important in coastal systems, right? And we don't have to, we need to sell them differently, perhaps.
Yeah. So Catriona, the question about seagrass and seaweed interactions, and then Thierry and Arnie, if you can both each ask your questions afterwards in very pithy ways. And then Catriona will answer, and then we'll wrap up on this part. So Catriona, seaweeds and seagrass interactions in carbon sequestration.
I don't, no idea, because they don't really grow in the same systems, right? I mean, do they? So seagrass grow in sediments and seaweed grow on rocks, apart from some seaweeds grow in sediments, and occasionally seagrass grow on rocks, but I don't think they interact as such. I'm not sure if that's the question that's being asked, though.
Maybe to be pursued. Quick interaction on this, Philippe.
Yeah, just where we have just a positive interaction which was shown in Ireland recently between the seaweed cultivations, kelp cultivations on the seaweed grass in the Bantry Bay, especially because seaweed cultivation was improving light penetration below the sea, and it seems that it was also beneficial for seagrasses.
All right, no, happy about that. I don't know that work, so thanks for that, Philippe.
All right, so Thierry and Arnie will collect your questions, and then Catriona will respond, and then we will start wrapping up. Thierry, over to you.
But to go back to this issue with seaweed and the seagrass, before, but I think now people are aware of it. It was the overlap of, especially in the tropics, of seaweed cultivation on ropes above
seagrass beds.
And then that was more a problem of shadowing. But I think more and more people are aware of you don't grow them on top of each other. No, my question was, you show us that equilibration times are much longer than we think. It's not instant. You show us also that the seawater is moving. It's not the same water. So generally people say, oh, well, just do an LCA. That's the magic word, life cycle assessment. Let's just do an LCA. But most of the time, the problem with modeling with LCA, it's the time scale. How long do we run the model? And the second thing is the size of the box, the modeling box. And you are showing us that if we want to do LCA, it's on a much longer term on a much bigger box. So how do we quantify that in LCA analysis?
And Arnie, let's
you have to ask a modeler. So
okay, that's easy.
So that's where you have to ask my colleagues, because they kind of do that. Leonard Bach, that's exactly what they do. So it's tricky. You know, you can do it for a global ocean, and if you see, there's a couple of papers, D'Angelo and other ones out recently, where they are trying to do this on very big scales, you know, for ocean afforestation, assuming that we are growing seaweeds on absolutely vast scales in the open ocean. But it's doing it on small scale that I think is more problematic, like the size of a normal seaweed bed or an aquaculture facility. You know, even a big, I mean, the big, you know, those big facilities in Japan and China would be ideal to start to try and work this out, those big aquaculture systems.
All right, last question to Arnie, and then, so quick question, quick answer, and then we'll wrap up.
Yes.
I can't do a quick answer.
I hate to see you sad on a nice summer's day, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere. But is there any reason to be sad yet? Surely,
in terms of
seaweed uses, well, in the terms of
only
your students.
The students are sad because they've been told that growing seaweed. We have a guy called Tim Flannery here who's been promoting this quite strongly. And the students have been told that if you grow seaweeds across the ocean, it will mitigate climate change without doing anything else. And that's why they're sad. They're not sad about other aspects. And I do teach them the other stuff too.
Surely they use carbon. Seaweeds use carbon.
They
do. It's a question of, so it's a question of how to sequestrate them and measure it. So it's just a challenge. It's no reason to be sad.
You could think of it as a challenge, but there's some fairly massive other issues about growing seaweeds in the open ocean that we haven't even started to discuss. So, and I think I've thrown it out there. I think this new paper coming out that will set that challenge, and people will start trying to figure that out.
Well, the sooner the better.
Hey?
So we have run out of time for this. My takeaway is that this is incredibly complex, and those who are just saying that this is a simplistic solution to climate change, to mitigate climate change, that there's a lot more to this than just grow seaweed, cut it, and have it fall to the bottom of the ocean, and hey presto, you have sequestered it. And Catriona, you've shone some great light on this, and we really appreciate it. I think it's really only the start of this conversation on this complex and highly relevant topic. Now it's time for some thanks, as well as a little promotional word from the coalition. So thank you, first of all, Catriona, for your amazing presentation and for taking
my pleasure
questions.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks to everyone in attendance for your engagement, your interesting questions, and you've really helped to make this a fantastic event. We really appreciate that. Thanks also to my colleagues in the Coalition Secretariat. Philippe, thank you for your scientific leadership. And Azadine, thanks so much for all of your help behind the scenes with organizing this event, as well as to Andrea for your help as well. We really appreciate that. Now, here's the promotional word. If you're not already a member of the coalition, and I think some of you might not be, then please join. It's easy to join. It's free. All it takes is a little bit of your time, a few keystrokes to go to the website and to become a member. And Azadine has or will be posting the website in the chat. And it just takes a few clicks, give a little bit of information about yourself. And then what it gives you access to is our bi-weekly newsletter, our member collaboration space where you can interact directly with other members of the coalition. And we now have over 1,000 members. I think we were up to 1,080 something recently. And very importantly, exclusive members only access to events. So let me repeat that, exclusive members only access. And that includes our annual meeting, which is being held this year in Paris on October 5th. there will be virtual access and there will be in-person access. And the in-person access is really, really important this time. So even though, you can join the live streaming, but if you join in person, you will also be able to attend, if your schedule permits, the first EU Algae Awareness Summit, and that's going to be a 3-day event. And only Global Seaweed Coalition members are being invited to that, outside the participants that the European Commission is inviting. So that is being held at the Maison de l'Océan in Paris. It's a beautiful venue, and the subject matter that's going to be discussed there, raising awareness of algae for European policymakers, will be very interesting. And there's going to be an exhibition throughout so people can try seaweed products. And on the Saturday, the 7th, it's going to be a public event. So that's not going to be exclusive members only, but you will have been able to try out some of the products beforehand. We will have chefs and high-level public figures on the 7th. So if you're able to be in Paris, do please register for this. It is, again, you have to register. It's by invitation only. And our Strategic Advisory Council and Scientific Council both will be meeting as well. So for those council members, and we're so glad to see so many of you on this call, we will be having a meeting in person during that time as well. And that will also be streamed, but if you can join us in person, that would be fantastic. So high-level speakers, chefs, seaweed value chain actors, showing off all the many multifaceted dimensions of seaweed. We're very excited about it. So we hope you found this event both useful and enjoyable, and we look forward to seeing many of you either online or in person at our annual meeting and at the EU Algae Summit. Thank you so much, and goodbye.